Try to imagine an evening far back in the past. No glowing cities, no engines humming, no electric lights cutting through the dark, only two rivers, the Tigris and the Euphrates, flowing slowly through the night. And along their banks, the earliest human communities in history, listening to the world with all their fragility. They did not know whether tomorrow would bring floods. They did not know whether the next season would bring drought. They did not know whether the child just born would survive the heat of summer or the cold of winter. And in a world where nature could erase everything in a single night, human beings did the only thing they could do. They told stories. But the stories of the Sumerians were not like the myths we are familiar with today. Here the gods were not all powerful, not all good, not moral ideals. They grew angry. They grew tired. They feared chaos. And sometimes they feared the very humans they had created. In the ancient Sumerian world, the gods did not exist to save humanity. They existed to keep the universe from collapsing, and human beings, small creatures between mud and floodwaters, were not born to be loved unconditionally, but to survive within an order harsher than any morality. Tonight we will not tell a story of good versus evil. We will tell a story far older than that. A story of ENKI, the god of wisdom, who secretly saved humanity from the gods themselves. ENLIL, the embodiment of order, authority, and the fear of humanity's noise. INANNA, the goddess of love and war, who dared to descend into death to reclaim her power. And Utu, the sun god, the one who sees everything and therefore is never deceived. This is not a story about a lost paradise. It is the story of the world's first civilization and how they learned to live, not in a fair world, but in a world that could be understood. If you are listening to this video at night, let the rhythm slow down. Let these ancient gods drift past like distant memories of humanity itself. And now, we begin where everything first took shape. At the lowest reaches of the ancient world, where the ground was always damp and the mud never fully dried, the Sumerians laid the foundations for how they understood life itself. Not through the brilliance of the sun or thunder in the sky, but through something far quieter, fresh water flowing beneath the earth. They called it the Abzu, not a river, not a lake, but the underlying current of existence, the source that nourished everything without ever needing to be seen. In their imagination, if the Abzu were to dry up, the world would not collapse in a single dramatic moment. It would wither slowly until nothing could remain standing. And it was there, in that low and shadowed realm, that they placed their god of wisdom. Not a god enthroned high above the world, not one who ruled through thunderous commands, nor an embodiment of punishment or glory. ENKI existed as a principle, the principle that the world could only continue if its most basic conditions were maintained. He did not govern fate through judgment, but through understanding. Not abstract or moral understanding, but understanding that was deeply practical, how water flows, how soil retains moisture when disease emerges, and how human memory might be preserved so it would not vanish with a single generation. The city associated with Enki Eridu was not remembered as a center of power or military might. It lay near marshlands where the land was difficult to cultivate, and water was both a blessing and a threat. To live there, people could not rely on prayer alone. They had to learn how to observe when water levels rose and fell, to observe how crops responded when floods came too early or too late, to observe how illness spread when water stagnated. And from these observations, they began to remember, then to record, and then to pass knowledge on. In its deepest sense, Eridu was not remembered as the first city simply because it was old, but because it embodied an early and remarkably sober shift in human thought. It marked the moment when people began to understand that survival could not rely solely on pleading with unseen forces, but had to be grounded in an attentive awareness of how the world actually worked. Water did not flow because it was prayed into obedience. Fields did not yield because of goodwill alone. Life endured only when patterns were observed, limits respected, and labor repeated with care. Eridu stood at the threshold of that realization, a place where myth and management quietly overlapped. In the Sumerian stories of creation, this realism is unmistakable. When human beings appear, there is no scene of cosmic celebration, no declaration of inherent dignity bestowed from above, no assurance that humanity occupies a privileged place in the universe. There is no fall from grace because there was no elevation to begin with. Humanity enters the world almost unnoticed, without ceremony, without blessing, and without promise. The tone is administrative rather than poetic, practical rather than reverent. Creation is not framed as an act of love, but as a solution. The gods in these texts are not weary in a sentimental sense. They do not sigh, lament, or feel compassion in a way recognizable to modern emotion. Their weariness is structural. The system is under strain. The world requires constant upkeep, and the burden of maintaining it has become inefficient. Rivers shift their course. Canals clog with silt. Embankments weaken under seasonal floods. Agriculture, the fragile backbone of civilization, demands unending attention. Without intervention, the land slips back toward chaos, not as punishment, but as inevitability. This is the context in which humanity is formed. Not as children of the gods, but as an added layer in the functioning of the cosmos. Humans are introduced to absorb labor, to take on the repetitive grinding tasks that keep the material world stable. Their role is not symbolic, it is operational. They dig, dredge, carry, plant, and rebuild. Through them, the rhythms of earth and water are kept in balance just long enough for cities to endure. Yet this beginning, austere as it is, does not strip humanity of meaning. On the contrary, it places meaning somewhere far more demanding. If life is not protected by divine affection, then it must be sustained through responsibility. If the world does not promise care, then care must be enacted. The Sumerian worldview does not flatter humanity, but it also does not abandon it. Humans are not exalted, but they are indispensable. They matter not because they are loved, but because without them, the system collapses. This perspective reflects how the Sumerians experienced their own existence. They lived on a plane where abundance and destruction were separated by only a few inches of water. Too little rain meant famine. Too much meant devastation. There was no illusion of safety, no expectation that the world would bend to human desire. Stability was always temporary, always earned, and always at risk. In such a world, hope alone was not enough. Survival depended on coordinated effort, on shared rules, and on the willingness to accept one's role within a larger structure. Eridu, as a symbolic beginning, captures this mindset. It is not a city born from aspiration toward heaven, but from attentiveness to earth. Its myths do not teach humanity how to escape the world, but how to remain within it without collapsing under its weight. The gods do not offer comfort. They offer structure. Humanity is not promised salvation. It is given a task. And in that task lies a quiet dignity. Not the dignity of chosenness, but the dignity of necessity. Human life in the Sumerian imagination matters because it holds the world together through work memory and continuity. This is not a comforting origin story. but it is a deeply honest one. It refuses illusion and replaces it with responsibility. And perhaps that is why it endured, pressed into clay, baked by time, and still capable of speaking to us with a voice that does not beg for belief, but asks for understanding. The Sumerians did not attempt to hide this truth behind comforting symbols. They did not turn human origins into a story of self-glorification. Instead, they acknowledged that every society, ancient or modern, is built upon the labor of the many, and that if one refuses to face this reality, order quickly becomes fragile. For when labor is obscured by myth, when the burden of sustaining the world is concealed beneath metaphysical promises, society loses the ability to understand itself. In Sumerian mythology, humanity is not insulted by this origin. People are not taught that they were born to dominate the world, but to live within it with all the limits, responsibilities, and risks that entails. This recognition forms an early, yet remarkably durable foundation of thought. That order is not something granted, but something that must be continually maintained. That existence is not a default right, but the result of an unending chain of effort. And in telling the story this way, the Sumerians inadvertently left later generations a rare and unflinching view of the human condition, not as the center of the universe, but as an indispensable component in keeping the universe functioning as it does. Remove humanity, and order does not become purer. It becomes empty, and sooner or later collapses under the weight of its own silence. Yet if humans existed only as tools, they would soon be crushed by the very environment they were created to serve. Water could sustain them, but it could also sweep everything away. Disease required no moral failing to spread. Land did not care about oaths. And here ENKI appears not as a savior, but as one who understands that a system remains stable only when its internal components are capable of self-adjustment. What ENKI gave humanity were not miracles that disrupted the natural order, but skills that allowed them to survive within it. The ability to measure water levels to know when to plant and when to wait. Techniques for digging canals so water nourished fields instead of destroying them. Methods of dividing labor so a community would not collapse from exhaustion. Medical knowledge sufficient to extend life by another harvest. And the art of preserving memory through marks on clay so experience would not die with a single generation. These gifts did not make the world perfect, but they made it livable. In Sumerian mythology, all of these capacities, skills, institutions, customs, and forms of knowledge were gathered under a single, remarkably subtle concept. Were not laws in the later juridical sense, and they were not moral commandments that separated good from evil. They were closer to operating principles of civilization itself, ways of doing things that had proven over time to keep a community from unraveling. If abandoned disorder followed, if mishandled imbalance emerged, and if held too rigidly, stagnation threatened. Existed precisely on that fragile boundary where order is never guaranteed, only maintained. What makes me so distinctive is that they were not imagined as eternal or perfect. They were not fixed truths handed down once and for all. Instead, they were patterns that had survived testing, sometimes painfully, against the realities of flood scarcity rivalry and human desire. Governed how a king ruled, how a priest spoke, how a craftsman worked, how a city organized labor, how festivals were held, how war was declared, and even how deception or ambition manifested. Civilization in this view was not held together by virtue, but by practice. Crucially, were not morally absolute. They did not promise that humans would become kinder, fairer, or wiser. They promised only that society could continue to function. Could enable irrigation and agriculture, but it could also enable taxation and control. A me could establish professions and skills, but it could just as easily lock people into inherited roles that were nearly impossible to escape. In other words, me were neutral in intent, but powerful in effect. They were tools, not ideals. This is why me feels so strikingly modern. They acknowledge something that many later religious systems tried to soften or deny, that the same structures which allow cooperation can also entrench inequality, and that order does not automatically align with justice. The Sumerians did not resolve this tension. They lived inside it. They accepted that civilization itself was morally ambiguous, yet still preferable to chaos. Even more telling is the way me could be abused, altered, transferred, or even stolen. In the myths, INANNA acquires the me through negotiation, intoxication, and cunning. This is not portrayed as sacrilege, but as risk. Knowledge moves, power shifts, order must be renegotiated. The me do not vanish when misused. Instead, they change hands, reshaping society in unpredictable ways. This portrayal treats knowledge not as divine perfection, but as something closer to lived human experience, unstable context, dependent and capable of growth as well as harm. Because of this, me resemble genuine human knowledge more than almost any other sacred concept from the ancient world. They are always incomplete, always provisional, always exposed to misuse. Yet they are also capable of adaptation. A society can learn. It can adjust its me. It can fail and then reassemble itself differently. Civilization in this sense is not a finished product, but an ongoing experiment. Perhaps this is the most sobering insight embedded in the idea of me, that order is not a moral reward, but a continuous responsibility. It must be carried, revised, and sometimes painfully corrected. The Sumerians did not imagine a golden age where everything worked perfectly. They imagined a world held together by fragile agreements, learned behaviors, and shared practices that demanded constant attention. In that quiet realism, me become something deeply human, not sacred because they are pure, but sacred because without them, nothing endures. Through these, me humanity did more than survive, it multiplied. Cities rose along riverbanks. Canals crisscrossed the plains. Footsteps labor and daily life grew louder and more numerous. Mesopotamia became crowded, noisy, and complex, not because of sin, but because of success. This is the deepest paradox in ENKI's story. The very things that saved humanity from extinction in the beginning became the forces that stretched order to its limits. In the world of the gods, unchecked growth was not a sign of prosperity, but of imbalance. Too many people meant too many variables. Too much activity meant that the old rhythms of land and water were no longer respected. And the noise mentioned in ancient texts was not merely sound, but a symptom of a system operating beyond its capacity to regulate itself. ENKI understood this better than any other god. Not because he was more compassionate, but because he grasped consequences. He knew that if humanity were wiped out entirely, knowledge would vanish with them. Canals would collapse. Fields would return to marsh and dust. And the order the gods sought to protect would have to be rebuilt from nothing at a far greater cost. For this reason, at this stage of the story, ENKI is no longer simply the god of water and wisdom. He becomes the symbol of a difficult choice to allow life to continue expanding, despite the instability it would cause, or to sever it in order to restore short-term order. The Sumerians do not answer this question with morality. They leave it unresolved, a lingering tension that signals what is to come will no longer be simple. For when life grows too powerful, order responds. And when order responds, it does not need persuasion. It only needs to act. At this point, the current of the story begins to shift slowly but irreversibly. the first measures of adjustment will appear, and further still, a decisive act will be taken. One, ENKI understands clearly, yet cannot prevent through direct confrontation. That is where the next part begins. When life spreads too quickly, the world does not need a moral judgment in order to respond. It only needs a boundary to be crossed. In the ancient texts of Sumer and Akkad, that boundary is not named with words like sin or corruption, but with a far simpler and far more unsettling concept: noise. Noise is not merely sound reverberating through space. It is the sign that the old rhythms of earth and water have been drowned out, that human presence has grown too dense for the system to regulate itself as it once did. When noise appears, order can no longer sense the silence it needs to function. In the Atrahasis, the gods do not say that humans are evil. They do not accuse them of moral failure or betrayal of any sacred law. They say only one thing briefly and coldly: humans have become too noisy. This is not an emotional judgment, but a diagnosis. For the Sumerians, what they called noise was never merely the sound of crowded cities or the clamor of human voices. It was a conceptual signal, a warning that a system had crossed a threshold it could no longer sustain. Noise meant excess. It meant compression. It meant that the space required for rhythms to unfold of land of water, of seasons of labor, had been consumed too completely by human activity. When noise arose, it was not because people were immoral, but because the balance between scale and structure had been lost. This understanding is cold, but it is also remarkably precise. A society may believe itself righteous. It may act with sincere intention, invoke the gods, perform rituals correctly, and still be heading toward collapse. In the Sumerian worldview, none of that mattered once pressure exceeded tolerance. Order does not evaluate intention. It does not weigh moral arguments. It does not listen to explanations. Order responds only to force accumulation and strain. When too much is demanded for too long, reaction is not optional, it is automatic. And that reaction does not arrive as a dramatic punishment. There is no thunderous declaration, no single catastrophic moment that announces judgment. Instead, adjustment begins quietly, almost reluctantly, as if the world itself were attempting to correct course with minimal damage. The earliest signs are subtle. Life becomes harder, not suddenly unbearable. The system tightens rather than shatters. Disease in this logic is not a curse hurled from above. It is a release valve. When population density rises beyond what infrastructure and resources can support, the human body becomes the site where excess pressure is relieved. Not because the body is hated, but because it is the most vulnerable component in the entire structure. Illness slows movement, reduces numbers, interrupts patterns that have become too intense. It is not moral, it is mechanical. Crop failures follow the same principle. They are not framed as divine retaliation for wrongdoing, but as signals that agricultural rhythms have drifted away from the cycles they depend upon. When humans extract more than the land can restore, when planting accelerates beyond regeneration, the land does not protest. It does not retaliate. It simply stops responding. Fertility fades. Yields shrink. What was once abundant becomes unreliable, then barren. Not because the earth is offended, but because it has been pushed past its limits. Drought, too, fits this pattern. It is not imagined as the land despising humanity, nor as the gods withholding rain in anger. It emerges when irrigation systems designed for a smaller, more manageable scale are stretched beyond what they can carry. Canals clog. Distribution becomes uneven. Underground reserves are drawn down faster than they can be replenished. Over time, water fails to reach where it is needed, and life contracts accordingly. The contraction is slow, impersonal, and devastating precisely because it offers no one to blame. In the Sumerian view, none of these processes exist to erase life entirely. They are not expressions of hatred, nor attempts at annihilation. They are systemic adjustments. Corrections triggered when growth overwhelms control, when expansion outruns structure. The goal is not destruction, but reduction to return the world to a scale at which it can function again, where order is no longer suffocated by its own success. This perspective strips catastrophe of drama, but it also strips it of cruelty. What happens is not vengeance. It is consequence. And consequence, once understood, is not arbitrary. It follows patterns. It leaves traces. It can be observed, remembered, and sometimes anticipated. That is why in Sumerian thought wisdom does not consist in moral purity or spiritual elevation, but in attentiveness to thresholds. To know when enough has become too much. To recognize when success itself has begun to generate instability. To understand that growth left unchecked carries within it the seed of correction. Noise, then, is not an accusation. It is a symptom. And like any symptom, it does not ask to be argued with. It asks to be understood. What makes these passages so striking is that the Sumerians do not attempt to comfort humanity with promises that all suffering carries some higher moral meaning. They accept that sometimes suffering is simply a signal that a system has been pushed too far. There are no clear villains. No absolute victims. Only a world responding to pressure in the only way it can. And because these gentle adjustments are not enough to quiet the noise, not enough to restore rhythm and balance, the story is forced to go further. When relief measures no longer work, order turns to its final option, not because it is more cruel, but because it has no alternatives left. Here the flow of the story crosses into a different threshold, where small corrections give way to a radical decision, and where ENKI's wisdom will face its greatest test. It is precisely here that ENKI's paradox becomes fully visible. Each time order tightens its grip, ENKI grants humanity new ways to adapt. He teaches them how to confront disease, how to change crop varieties, how to organize communities to endure scarcity. Each solution is rational. Each solution saves lives. And each solution allows life to continue expanding, making the noise thicker, deeper, harder to ignore. There is no malice in this chain of events, only consequences following consequences. Knowledge once given does not return to its original state. It opens new possibilities, and those possibilities generate new pressures on the overall order. ENKI understands this, but he also understands that withdrawing knowledge would mean immediate collapse. Between the two choices, allowing life to wither through ignorance or allowing order to be tested by growth, ENKI always chooses the second, knowing it is more dangerous in the long run. Eventually, soft measures are no longer sufficient. When incremental adjustments fail to restore balance, the Council of the Gods makes the most drastic decision a system can make: the Great Flood. In the Sumerian telling, this is not an outburst of rage, but a final act of administration intended to reset the world to a scale at which it can function. Water, once the source of life, becomes the instrument for removing its excess. ENKI knows of the decision before it is carried out. Not because he holds greater authority, but because he understands the logic of order, and he knows that direct opposition will change nothing. In the world of the gods, laws are not debated, they are obeyed. The only question that remains is whether there is a way to preserve the core of life without shattering the structure of power that governs the system. The path ENKI chooses is not rebellion, but circumvention. Bound by an oath not to warn humanity directly, he does not speak to humans. He speaks to a reed wall. He speaks to a roof. He lets the warning drift into space, an echo, addressed to no one, yet still capable of being heard. This is not deceit, but a precise use of the limits of language and law. The one who hears that echo is Ziusudra, not a hero in the sense of a warrior, but a human lucid enough to recognize that the world is about to cross an irreversible boundary. The boat he builds is not a symbol of romantic hope, but an emergency archive seed species and the memory of a disappearing order. When the waters rise, there is no total salvation, no promise that catastrophe will never return, only the fragile continuation of life preserved under the most minimal conditions. When the waters recede, the world does not become better. It simply becomes less. Fewer humans, less noise, less pressure, and in the silence, after the flood order, can breathe again. This is the detail the Sumerians never avoid. The Great Flood is not the beginning of a new moral age. It is only the rebalancing of a system stretched too far. Ziusudra does not become ruler of the new world. Humanity is not granted collective immortality. People continue to live with the same limits, with labor, with disease, with anxiety, before nature. But now they live with a deeper memory, the memory that their existence is not guaranteed, but the result of a silent, intellectual choice. Throughout the entire story, ENKI does not appear as a compassionate god in an emotional sense. He does not weep for humanity. He does not promise a brighter future. He does only one thing and does it completely. He prevents life from being erased by the very order it serves. ENKI's wisdom lies not in breaking the system, but in preventing the system from destroying itself when it becomes too rigid. And here, Sumerian mythology reaches a rare depth. It does not tell a story of humanity triumphing over the gods, nor of infinite benevolence and power. It tells of the permanent tension between order and life, between law and adaptation. ENKI stands at that point of tension, not as one who resolves the conflict, but as one who prolongs time just enough for the world to survive one more cycle. But if ENKI represents flexible intelligence, the ability to slip through the cracks of law to preserve life, the story cannot end there. For a world cannot survive on flexibility alone. It requires a counterweight, a principle that does not compromise, does not adapt to emotion, and does not retreat before noise. That principle is called ENLIL. If ENKI is present, like quiet wisdom flowing beneath the earth, then ENLIL appears like the weight of the sky pressing down upon the whole world. He does not need to come close to human beings to be felt. A shift in the wind thickening clouds, or a sudden storm sweeping across the plain is enough for ENLIL's presence to become undeniable. For the Sumerians, ENLIL was not only a god with power, he was the sense that order always exists above overarching, not clearly seen, yet always capable of forcing everything back into its place. The place where ENLIL's power converges is Nippur, and this choice is deeply revealing. Nippur was not the largest city, not the richest, not the most militarized, nor the most politically ambitious. It did not dominate trade routes, nor did it rule through force. Instead, it existed according to a quieter and far more demanding logic. It was imagined as the immovable center of order. In a landscape where cities could vanish after a single disastrous flood season, where dynasties rose and fell with warfare and drought, Nippur was not meant to compete. It was meant to remain. This endurance was not accidental. Nippur's importance did not come from human success, but from restraint. It was not celebrated for what it produced, but for what it preserved. In Sumerian imagination, Nippur functioned as a place where the rules themselves were housed, not invented, not debated, but held. To move Nippur to diminish it, or to replace it with another center, would have meant something far more dangerous than political change. It would have meant that order itself was negotiable. At the heart of Nippur stood the temple of Ekur, whose name already carries its meaning, House of the Mountain. But this mountain was not a challenge to the sky. It was not an attempt to reach upward, to conquer, or transcend. Ekur does not rise in defiance. It stands in admission. It acknowledges that the world requires a fixed point not to dominate it, but to prevent it from sliding apart. Ekur does not shout its presence. It does not dazzle. It simply remains, and in remaining, it holds the world steady. There is something profoundly unheroic about this vision, and that is precisely its strength. Ekur does not promise glory. It does not inspire conquest. It does not fuel ambition. Instead, it quietly insists on limits. It reminds rulers that authority is not the same as ownership. It reminds cities that expansion has consequences. It reminds communities that there must be at least one place where human desire does not dictate change. For the Sumerians, this carried a meaning that was both spiritual and practical. Order, they believed, does not need to be demonstrated daily through spectacle or force. It does not need to prove itself through growth or success. It needs to be kept intact. And keeping something intact often requires resisting the urge to improve it, enlarge it, or bend it to immediate advantage. In this sense, Ekur was never merely a religious structure. It was an imagined axis, a point around which the rest of the world could turn without losing coherence. It told people that while cities may expand, fields may be reclaimed from marshes, and populations may increase, there must always be something that does not follow that momentum. There must be a boundary that does not move simply because movement is possible. This is a difficult idea for modern minds to accept. We are accustomed to associating progress with constant expansion, flexibility, and disruption. But the Sumerian worldview understood something that remains unsettlingly relevant. Without a fixed reference point, motion becomes meaningless. Growth without anchoring principles does not lead to stability. It leads to disintegration. In Sumerian thought, stability is not the absence of movement. Rivers must flow. People must work. Cities must change. Stability is the presence of a frame within which that movement can occur without destroying the system that supports it. Just as a loom requires a fixed frame to produce fabric, society requires an axis to produce continuity. When every boundary can be pushed, when every rule can be renegotiated, when no place is exempt from desire or ambition, the world does not become freer, it becomes shapeless. And a shapeless world cannot sustain life for long. Growth untethered from order collapses under its own weight. Nippur then was not powerful because it commanded armies or wealth. It was powerful because it did not move. It existed as a reminder that not everything should respond to human will, that some things must remain beyond negotiation if anything else is to endure. In this quiet, restrained vision, ENLIL's authority is not loud. It does not dazzle or seduce. It does not promise happiness. It promises structure. And in a world as fragile as the Mesopotamian plain, where too much water or too little could erase generations of labor, that promise was not abstract philosophy. It was survival. Order in this understanding is not imposed to dominate life. It is maintained so that life can continue at all. That is why Nippur did not need to be the strongest city in order to be the most important. Its power lay not in soldiers or wealth, but in its symbolic role, it reminded people that some things should not be optimized, should not be expanded, and should not be placed on the scale of benefit. Order in that imagination is not the product of flexibility, but the result of accepting to remain still at a certain point, even as everything around continues to move. Enlil is bound to Nippur and Ekkur because he represents that very idea. He does not bend with circumstance, does not adjust to emotion, does not respond to humanity's desire for endless expansion. His presence is like a silent pressure. No one sees it clearly, yet everyone feels it. And that pressure exists to remind them that without limits, the world does not need destruction. In order to collapse, it will dissolve under its own uncontrolled motion. Enlil did not create human beings, and he did not teach them how to adapt. His role is not flexibility, but keeping the overall structure from falling apart. He is not concerned with each individual fate, because for Enlil, clinging to detail can blur the larger picture. What he sees is the rhythm of the entire system. Seasons winds, rains population, and the level of pressure all these elements place upon the shared order. That is why when human beings became numerous and noisy, Enlil did not hear the joy of life. He heard the warning signal of a system being stretched. Noise in this sense is imbalance amplified. It signals that natural rhythms no longer have enough silence to regulate themselves, that expansion has exceeded the environment's and society's capacity to absorb it. For Enlil, ignoring that signal is not compassion, it is blindness. The first measures approve disease. Drought crop failure do not carry the color of wrath. They resemble pressure release valves in a closed system triggered to prevent total collapse. They force human beings to slow down, to contract, to remember that the world cannot be infinite. In Enlil's logic, that is the only way to preserve order in the long term, even if the cost is pain in the short term. If we look more deeply at how the Sumerians placed their gods into space, the difference between Enlil Nippur and ENKI Eridu is no longer a simple opposition between two divine personalities. It becomes two fundamentally different understandings of how a world can remain standing. Nippur and Eridu are not merely cities on an ancient map. They are spatial metaphors for two operating principles, opposing yet mutually necessary. Nippur is imagined as a place that stands still. It does not need to sit in the most advantageous position for trade, nor does it need to be tied to material prosperity. Its value lies in one thing: it does not move. In the Sumerian imagination, Nippur is like a stake driven deep into the ground, a point of reference to which every surrounding movement must relate. Enlil is tied to Nippur because he represents what cannot be negotiated, limits discipline and structure. Here, order is not something created anew each day. It is something that must remain intact so that all other movement does not become meaningless. Eridu, by contrast, is not a fixed point, but a place of flow. Near marshes, canals where fresh water and salt water meet Eridu forces human beings to adapt continuously. No season is exactly like another. No water level remains stable long enough to lean upon. ENKI is tied to Eridu because he represents knowledge born from observation and adjustment. Here the world is not held in place. It is read and adapted to step by step. This contrast shows that the Sumerians did not choose only one of the two. They did not place Enlil above ENKI, nor allow Eridu to replace Nippur. They understood that a world with only a fixed point would become a prison, but a world with only flow would dissolve on its own. Nippur reminds people that not every boundary can be pushed back, that some things must not be allowed to shift if order is to endure. Eridu reminds them that even those boundaries are not enough without the ability to adapt to the volatility of reality. In this arrangement, ENLIL and ENKI are not enemies, but two poles of the same problem. ENLIL keeps the world from drifting too far from its structure. ENKI keeps the world from being crushed by that structure. One is pressure from above, forcing everything back into place. One is flexibility from below, allowing life to slip through the cracks of order. Without ENLIL, all movement becomes unanchored. Without ENKI, all order becomes rigid and dead. The Sumerians chose to tell their story by placing those two cities in parallel, like two markers in collective memory. Each time human beings expand, Eridu gives them the tools to survive. And each time that expansion exceeds the limit, Nippur reminds them there must be a place that cannot keep moving outward. Between those two poles, history forms not as a straight line of progress, but as a continuous oscillation between adaptation and discipline, between flow and anchor. And in that oscillation, Sumerian mythology finds its truth. A world endures only when it accepts living with contradiction, rather than trying to erase one pole entirely. ENLIL Nippur and ENKI Eridu are not two separate stories, but two halves of the same structure, a structure that, if missing one half, leaves the whole world with nowhere to stand. When gentle corrective measures no longer work, when disease fails to reduce pressure quickly enough, when drought and crop failure cause humanity to contract only briefly, before expanding again through the skills it has learned, the world of Sumerian myth reaches a very particular moment, the moment when order can no longer continue to negotiate with life. What matters here is that the Sumerians do not tell this story as a moral dispute, nor do they paint a simple picture in which the gods become cruel out of anger. They tell it as a problem of thresholds. When a system is stretched for too long, it is eventually forced to choose a decisive action, not because it wishes to, but because if it does not, it will collapse in ways that cannot be controlled. And when that happens, it is not only humanity that is lost, but the very order the gods represent as well. Within this logic, the decision of the Great Flood does not resemble a verdict aimed at the guilty, but rather a safety mechanism triggered when pressure exceeds tolerance. Water becomes the instrument because in the Mesopotamian world, water is both the source of life and the force that erases it. The Sumerians lived with the memory that rivers could nourish fields, but could also change course within a single season, sweep away entire villages, and leave behind plains so altered they seemed never to have known human footsteps. They understood, therefore, that some catastrophes are not personal. They target no one. They occur as the cold operation of matter itself. By assigning this decision to ENLIL, the Sumerians do not turn him into a villain. They turn him into the face of what humans fear most, an order incapable of empathy, because its task is not to feel, but to endure. At this stage of the story, ENLIL resembles the guardian of the boundary. If ENKI is the flow that allows life to slip through, ENLIL is the barrier that forces that flow to stop. And the most frightening thing about ENLIL is not that he is violent. It is that he is rational in the way a structure is rational. At the level of individuals, a person, a family, a city, life always holds absolute value. But at the level of systems, those absolutes become quantities that must be weighed. The Sumerians dared to confront this uncomfortable truth that there are moments when order is preserved through decisions that, when viewed from the ground, always appear unjust, but when seen from above, resemble the survival of the structure itself. For this reason, the Great Flood in the Sumerian world is not a final warning meant to make humanity more moral. It promises no better world. It merely makes the world quieter. and that silence is not described as a reward. It resembles the empty space after pressure has been released, where order can breathe again. This is the crucial point the Sumerians do not claim, that humanity becomes purified once the waters recede. They say only that the world becomes manageable again. For them, that already constitutes a form of stability, and in a land perpetually exposed to upheaval, stability is sometimes the greatest luxury imaginable. Yet it is precisely here that the deepest contradiction of the story emerges. ENLIL's order, when fully enacted, can preserve structure, but it can also erase the very thing that gives that structure meaning, life itself. A system so perfect that it permits no variables becomes a dead system. By introducing ENKI as a counterforce, the Sumerians acknowledge that order, if it does not know how to leave a gap, will ultimately annihilate the foundation upon which it stands. ENKI saves life not because he opposes order, but because he recognizes another truth, that order exists not merely to stand firm, but to allow something to live within it. ENKI's intervention, slipping around his oath, speaking to a reed wall, letting the warning drift towards Ziusudra, is not a revolution. It is an act of intelligence confronting an inflexible principle. And this is what gives the Sumerian story its rare maturity. They do not sanctify rebellion, nor do they sanctify obedience. They place intelligence between the two extremes as an art of living, knowing when to comply so the system does not collapse, and knowing when to bend so the system does not kill itself. In this view, ENKI does not overthrow ENLIL. He merely prevents ENLIL from reaching the absolute endpoint where order becomes perfect emptiness. And because the Sumerians tell their myth this way, ENLIL is not condemned after the flood. He is not defeated. He is not dethroned. He continues to exist, still the principle of order, still the weight of the sky. This narrative choice is essential because it shows that they were not seeking emotional justice. They were seeking a model to explain the world, one in which cold forces must still be acknowledged if society is to endure through time. ENLIL thus resembles how humans understand law itself. Law can protect, but it can also crush. Law does not hate, but it can cause pain. And law without limits can become a machine that rots from within because it forgets that the ultimate purpose of order is to give life a place to stand. In this sense, the noise in the Atrahasis becomes the starting point of a permanent debate between two questions. How much life does the world need, and how much life can the world endure? Listeners often want to side with life and treat anyone who imposes limits as an enemy. But the Sumerians do not allow that simplicity. They force the listener to see that life without limits is like water. Without banks, it will overflow, and when it does, it no longer nourishes, it destroys. They also force the listener to see that order without openings is like a dam without release. Valves it may hold for a time, but when it breaks, it destroys far more violently than any overflow. ENLIL and ENKI, therefore, are not figures for choosing sides. They are conditions for understanding why the world both exists and threatens to cease existing. After the Great Flood, what remains is not the joy of victory, but a cold memory, the memory that there are moments when order will say enough, and it will say so without explanation. For communities living between two rivers, this was not distant philosophy. It was lived experience. A single great flood could erase a lifetime of labor. A year of drought could turn granaries into empty ash. And when one lives long enough in such a world, one begins to understand that some events do not come to make you better. They come to return you to your smallness within a larger system. Yet at the same time, the story plants a distinctly Sumerian seed of hope. Hope does not lie in order becoming compassionate, but in intelligence, finding a way to live within order. ENKI does not promise that storms will stop. He teaches humans how to build better roofs. He does not promise that floods will never return. He preserves the seeds so that after the flood, life can begin again. And ENLIL, in contrast, does not promise safety. He reminds humanity that when limits are forgotten, the world will remind them in ways harsher than any warning. Here, ENLIL's chapter closes not with a moral conclusion, but with the feeling that order is something you cannot love, yet cannot live without. And precisely because order can become so heavy, the Sumerians place at the center of their mythology another force, one that does not represent limits or stability, but rupture movement, desire, and change. A force that prevents the world from freezing into a heartless mechanism, even as it ensures the world is never fully at rest. That force is called INANNA. If ENLIL is the weight of the sky that forces everything to remain in its proper place, and ENKI is the quiet current that allows life to find pathways through the cracks of order, then INANNA appears as a quickened heartbeat in the body of the world, not to keep it stable, but to ensure that it is still alive. The Sumerians did not place INANNA at the margins of mythology as a dangerous anomaly. They placed her at the center of those moments when human beings most clearly feel that existence is not merely about maintenance, but about longing for more than what already exists. INANNA is called the goddess of love and war, but if we see these two domains only as opposites, one as union, the other as destruction, we miss the essential point the Sumerians were making. For them, love and war were not moral opposites, but two states of the same force. That force begins with desire, the desire to move beyond what is given, and ends in conflict when that desire collides with the limits of the world. In INANNA's world, love is not understood as lasting harmony or calm. It is an attraction so powerful that it breaks old orders apart. When people love another person, a greater power, a more radiant city, a wider future, they are pulled out of the safe positions that order has arranged for them. They are willing to trade honor, wealth, status, even life itself, to move toward what is calling them. Love, in this sense, is the engine of movement. It pulls humanity out of stillness, and for that very reason, it is dangerous by nature. But the world is not infinite. Not every desire can coexist. When the pull of one community meets the pull of another, when the ambitions of one city collide with those of another, love ceases to be a private matter. It expands into dispute. And here war appears not as a betrayal of love, but as its inevitable consequence. War in Sumerian thought is the moment when forces of attraction push the world beyond what an old structure can contain. That is why INANNA, ruling both love and war, is not a contradiction. It is in fact one of the most psychologically precise insights of the Sumerian worldview. The same force that draws people together into intimacy, reproduction, alliance, and collective expansion is the force that drives them apart when boundaries harden and desire exceeds what the existing world can accommodate. The Sumerians did not try to purify love by stripping it of danger, nor did they explain war as mere chaos or moral failure. They recognized that both arise from the same deep current of intensity within human life. To love is to want more than one has, more closeness, more continuity, more future. To build a city is to love life enough to anchor it in walls, fields, and memory. But that same wanting, once concentrated, once multiplied across a population, inevitably presses against limits, land, water, status, recognition. When those limits refuse to move, desire does not disappear. it changes form. What once sought union begins to seek dominance. What once wanted to grow begins to want to take. Inanna embodies that transformation without disguising it. In this sense, Inanna is not a goddess of softness or comfort. She is a goddess of intensity of heat rather than warmth. She represents the moment when feeling becomes too strong to remain private, when emotion spills outward into action that reshapes the world. Her domain is not affection, but forceful attachment. Not romance, but the drive that insists on expression regardless of cost. When that drive is satisfied, it produces fertility, prosperity, and cultural flowering. Fields are planted. Lineages expand. Cities thrive. When that same drive is blocked by scarcity, by rigid hierarchy, by closed borders, it does not quietly fade. It erupts. This is why the Sumerians did not imagine war as the opposite of civilization, but as one of its consequences. War is not what happens when order fails completely. It is what happens when order becomes too narrow to contain the life it has helped generate. Inanna stands precisely at that threshold. She is invoked at festivals to awaken desire, not merely sexual desire, but the will to live intensely, to expand beyond the present, to take risks. And she is invoked on battlefields to legitimize conflict, not as madness or evil, but as the continuation of the same energy when peaceful expansion is no longer possible. Seen this way, festivals and battlefields are not opposites. They are two arenas in which excess energy is released. One releases it through creation, the other through destruction. Both are dangerous. Both are transformative. And both lie beyond the calm administrative control of ENLIL's order. ENLIL governs stability, hierarchy, and continuity. He maintains what already exists. Inanna governs what refuses to stay contained. This is also why ENLIL cannot eliminate Inanna, no matter how disruptive she appears. To remove her would be to freeze the world in permanent stasis. Order without desire does not endure. It ossifies. Cities without Inanna may remain peaceful for a time, but they will slowly empty of vitality. No new bonds form. No risks are taken. No expansion occurs. The system survives, but only by becoming brittle. And brittle systems shatter when pressure finally arrives. Inanna is that pressure personified. She is the reminder that life is not content with equilibrium alone. It seeks movement, escalation, intensity. The Sumerians understood that this force could not be moralized away. It could not be safely ignored. It had to be acknowledged, ritualized, and given symbolic space, because when intensity is denied recognition, it does not disappear. It returns as catastrophe. Inanna's myths are filled with crossing boundaries, descending into the underworld, challenging older gods, overturning expectations. These are not tales of irresponsibility. They are acknowledgments that no system remains adequate forever. Desire will always test the edges of order. Sometimes that testing leads to renewal. Sometimes it leads to collapse. Inanna does not guarantee a good outcome. She guarantees movement, and perhaps that is the most unsettling honesty of the Sumerian imagination. They did not believe that love could be made safe or that power could be made gentle without cost. They accepted that the same impulse that builds a city can also burn another to the ground. Inanna does not resolve that tension. She holds it openly without apology. In doing so, she reveals something deeply human, that civilization is not driven only by reason and law, but by forces that exceed calculation. Order may decide how long a society lasts, but intensity decides whether it lives at all. By placing love and war under the authority of the same goddess, the Sumerians made a bold claim: conflict does not occur when love fails. Conflict occurs when love succeeds too well. When desire grows strong enough to break boundaries, it will continue to break others if there is no space left to expand. At that point, war ceases to be an exception and becomes the collective expression of a force that has exceeded the individual scale. For this reason, Inanna is not portrayed as a goddess of comfort or reconciliation. She is portrayed as a goddess of an uncomfortable truth, that what makes humanity feel most alive is also what pushes it into its greatest danger. That no society can benefit from desire without paying the price of conflict. And that history in the end is written in moments when love and war can no longer be separated. In this logic, Inanna's dual role is not a paradox. It is a diagnosis of how desire operates in the human world, beginning as attraction, continuing as expansion, and ending in collision when the world can no longer contain everything humanity wants. Imagine a festival in a flourishing Sumerian city. In the square, a procession moves forward amid drums and shouted chants. Bright fabrics billow. Resin burns in the hot air. Inanna is invoked in song not as a distant deity, but as a presence flooding into the crowd. There she promises no order. She promises surging life, abundant harvests, fertility, love, and the feeling that tomorrow might be greater than today. In such moments, people feel Inanna closer than any other god because she speaks the language of desire. But Inanna does not live only in festivals. She enters palaces where power is calculated and distributed. In the stories of her taking the me, the patterns by which society functions, Inanna does not ask, she takes. This act is not told as petty theft, but as a political truth. Power is not always transferred by consent. There are moments in history when old structures no longer satisfy new desires, and redistribution occurs through uneasy means. In that image, Inanna resembles a queen who refuses an assigned role. She challenges limits not to destroy the world, but to restructure it around new drives. The Sumerians do not condemn her ambition. They understand that without such forces, society would freeze within outdated orders, and when those orders cease to fit, reality collapse arrives far more violently. Now consider Inanna on the battlefield. Here she is not the goddess of tactics or discipline. She is the fever that drives soldiers forward when reason tells them to stop. She is the moment when honor becomes more important than survival, and victory is pursued not only for material gain, but for the need to assert position. War seen this way is not an individual mistake, but a collective consequence of desire, suppressed for too long. What makes Inanna both desired and feared is that she is not loyal to stability. When desire is fulfilled, she brings prosperity. When desire is blocked, she brings conflict. She does not side with humans or gods. She sides with the force that pushes everything out of stillness. For the Sumerians, this was not divine injustice, but the logic of life itself. No society can remain motionless forever without paying the price in eruption. In her relationship with ENLIL, Inanna is the challenge that order can never fully eliminate. ENLIL needs limits so the world does not dissolve. Inanna needs broken limits so the world does not petrify. The two forces do not seek to destroy one another. They strain against each other, generating the oscillation within which history is written. When order tightens, Inanna awakens desire. When desire exceeds its bounds, order reacts. The Sumerians did not choose sides. They lived within that oscillation. In her relationship with Enki, Inanna is no obedient student of wisdom either. If Enki teaches humanity how to adapt in order to survive, Inanna makes them want more than adaptation allows. Knowledge may build better canals, but it cannot extinguish the urge to expand. Skill may prolong life, but it cannot decide what that life will be used for. Here, Inanna reminds us that not every problem has a technical solution. Some forces in humanity lie beyond calculation. Imagine a city that has been stable for too long. Canals function smoothly. Laws are observed. Harvests are regular. This is ENLIL's ideal and Enki's achievement. But within that stability, Inanna begins to whisper. She whispers of distant lands, of greater power, of unclaimed glory. At first it is personal desire. Then it spreads. Then it becomes policy. And before order can respond, the world has already moved. The Sumerians did not hide the danger of this process. They knew Inanna carried loss. She does not promise that every change will be good. She only ensures that nothing remains still forever. And in a world where nature could erase the work of generations in a single flood season movement, however dangerous was sometimes the only alternative to stagnation and death. For this reason, Inanna is not told as a goddess of comfort. She is told as a goddess of an uncomfortable truth that life, in order to continue, must accept risk. That desire to be fulfilled will generate conflict, and that history to move forward requires forces willing to break temporary equilibrium. The Sumerians looked at Inanna and did not ask whether she was fair. They asked, without her, would the world still move? But Inanna's story does not end at the surface of power and desire. A force that only pushes forward without confronting the ultimate limit would remain shallow. To become a complete force of the world, Inanna must go to the place where all power loses its effect, where order, wisdom, and desire are stripped of their surface meanings. And so Inanna descends. Inanna does not descend into the underworld because she is punished, nor because she has failed in power or in love. In the Sumerian texts, this decision is not portrayed as random. It is told as a conscious choice, almost an inevitable one, made by a force that has reached the limit of itself. When desire has expanded the world to its furthest extent, when power has touched every space it can reach, when love and war have shaken the surface of order, there remains only one place. Inanna has not yet entered the place where all forces come to a stop. The underworld Kur is not hell in the moral sense familiar to later religious traditions. It is not designed to judge, does not exist, to punish the wicked or reward the righteous, and does not operate according to the moral memory of life above. In Sumerian thought, Kur is the realm where movement ends. Not a violent ending, but an absolute cessation. There is no forward or backward there, no territorial expansion, no accumulation of power, no reproduction to offset loss. All the familiar rhythms of life seasons, labor, desire, dissolve, leaving behind a flattened state where the distinctions that once defined the surface world are erased. Kur, therefore, is not the opposite of heaven, but the opposite of history. If history is shaped by movement, ambition, and the drive to surpass limits, then Kur is the place where history can no longer continue. There are no new stories to tell there, because all stories have ended. And for this very reason, Kur possesses a frightening yet honest quality. It does not hate life, but it does not need life either. It exists as a space the world must acknowledge, because without a place where all movement stops, movement above would lose its meaning. Within this logic, Inanna's descent cannot begin with violence. There is no battle to conquer death because Kur is not a territory that can be taken. There is no enemy to defeat because Kur does not function as an opposing power. Instead, the journey begins with ritual, because ritual is the only way a being of movement can enter a space where movement is no longer permitted. Ritual does not aim to defeat Kur, it aims to adapt to the laws of Kur. Inanna prepares her garment symbols and powers not to display them, but to carry with her the full identity she has built in the upper world. Each item she wears, crown jewelry, insignia of authority, is proof that she has the right to move, the right to be heard, the right to influence the world. These are not merely objects, they are passports of power, allowing her to exist as an operative force within the realm of life. And for that very reason, each gate of Kur demands a stripping away. Not because the underworld envies power, and not because it seeks to humiliate Inanna, simply because the laws of Kur do not allow power to exist. Where all movement stops, all symbols of movement status, desire, influence become meaningless. Each time Inanna passes through a gate and is deprived of a layer of her identity, this is not punishment, but a necessary adjustment so that she may continue downward without fracturing the structure of that space. This stripping away does not occur abruptly, but in layers and stages. It reflects a profound Sumerian understanding. Death does not erase a being in a single instant, but gradually removes what allows that being to act in the world. First comes power, then influence, and finally the very notion of selfhood. As Inanna descends further, she is no longer the goddess of love or war. She becomes a bare existence, carrying none of the advantages of the surface world. At this point, the story no longer speaks of Inanna as an individual, but of the limits of all operative forces. The Sumerians seem to emphasize that no power, no matter how dominant it is on Earth, can carry its full identity into the place where movement ends. Any force that seeks to reach the ultimate boundary must accept the loss of what once defined its strength. This is not a moral lesson, but a direct description of the structure of existence. Kur does not defeat Inanna, it reveals her limits. And her willingness to continue to shed each layer of identity is not a sign of failure, but of a force reaching its most complete form. A force that rules only the surface will always remain shallow. Only by confronting the place where it no longer functions can a force understand its true value within the whole of the world. In this telling, the Sumerians do not attempt to soften the fear of death, nor do they turn it into consolation. They place death precisely where it belongs, as a necessary space, so that the upper world does not become infinite and chaotic. And Inanna, by descending into Kur through ritual and stripping, becomes the only figure willing to walk that entire path, not to conquer death, but to integrate death into the operating structure of life. Passing through the first gate, Inanna is still herself. Passing through the second, her presence begins to change. And by the final gate, she has nothing left to defend, nothing left to bargain with. The Sumerians recount this moment not with pity, but with cold precision. Every power that seeks the ultimate boundary must pay the price of losing what once made it powerful. Inanna, hanging as an inert body, is not described as a tragic death, but as a state of suspension. Life is not destroyed, it is paused. And this pause reveals a crucial truth. The upper world, even with Enlil's order and ENKI's wisdom, still depends on Inanna's force to keep moving. When she is absent, it is not only love that disappears, but the very intensity of living. Trees do not die immediately. Cities do not collapse at once. But everything becomes heavy stagnant, as though the world continues only by inertia. This is a remarkably subtle moment in Sumerian mythology. It does not claim that Inanna is the moral center of the universe. It claims that momentum is irreplaceable. A world may possess perfect order and refined adaptive skill, but without desire, aspiration, and vital intensity, it becomes a body without a soul. And the Sumerians did not see that as an ideal. Inanna's return does not occur as an unconditional miracle. It requires a substitution. The laws of the underworld cannot be broken. They can only be satisfied. One life must remain so another may return. The myth does not shy away from the cruelty of this exchange. It does not soften the cost of rebirth. It states plainly that every return is purchased through loss, and that no power is great enough to avoid this truth. When Inanna returns to the upper world, she is no longer a purely surface force. She carries the memory of the place where all movement ends. This transforms the nature of her power. Love is no longer a naive pull. War is no longer merely an eruption of desire. Both are now bound to the awareness that every crossing of limits demands a corresponding payment. Inanna becomes more dangerous, but also more real. In relation to ENLIL, Inanna's descent is a reminder that order is not the end of history. Order can keep the world standing, but it cannot generate momentum on its own. In relation to ENKI, the descent is a warning that wisdom cannot solve everything through skill and adaptation. There are moments when knowledge can only observe because the issue is not how to proceed, but whether proceeding still holds meaning. The Sumerians did not demand that listeners choose sides for or against Inanna. They did not turn her descent into a simple moral lesson. Instead, they confronted the listener with an unsettling recognition that for the world to keep moving, desire must sometimes die in part so that it may return in another form. No rebirth preserves its original shape. Thus, the descent of Inanna is not merely the story of a goddess. It is a model the Sumerians used to understand every major cycle of life. Crops must wither so the land can rest. Cities must fall so history can reorganize. Power must be lost so another form of power can emerge. Inanna descends not to fail, but to learn how to return without destroying the world. When the story ends, Inanna brings no promise of eternal peace. She offers no lasting stability. She brings something else, the understanding that movement and stillness, life and death, desire and limit are not opposing forces, but successive phases of the same process. The world exists not because it always advances, but because it knows when to descend. At this point, Sumerian mythology completes a tense triangle of power. ENLIL preserves limits, ENKI sustains adaptability, and Inanna ensures that the world does not freeze within its own stability. But for this triangle not to collapse into conflict or chaos, another force is needed, one that neither pushes nor restrains, but observes and reveals, a light that passes through all things untouched by desire or order. That light belongs to Utu. If ENLIL is the weight that forces the world to stand firm, if ENKI is the intelligence that helps life find a way through the cracks of limitation, and if Inanna is the force that prevents history from freezing into stillness, then Utu appears as the condition that makes it impossible for all those forces to hide themselves. He does not propel, he does not restrain, he does not lure, he illuminates. And in the ancient world, illumination is not a neutral act. Light is power. Each morning when the sun rises above the horizon of the Mesopotamian plain, it is not merely the beginning of another day of labor. It is the moment the world enters a state of visibility. For the Sumerians, Utu is not a distant god. He moves across the sky along a fixed path, And it is precisely that repetition that makes him the most frightening witness. Not because he punishes immediately, but because he does not forget. What happens under the sunlight is carried along in his journey from the lowlands, across hills and mountains. And when night falls, it continues into the world below, where even darkness is no longer a refuge. Ancient stories say that Utu sees what people believe no one has witnessed: an agreement broken in a back courtyard, an oath spoken falsely when there are no human observers, a powerful man coercing the weak in the silence of noon. These stories do not end in miracles or thunder. They end in consequences. A family loses its reputation. A lineage is turned away from. A city slips into instability because trust has been eroded. Utu's justice does not arrive as rage. It arrives as the slow exposure of truth. In the Sumerian city-states, when disputes arose, people did not invoke only laws or kings. They invoked Utu. Not because he would descend to solve the matter for them, but because once a case was placed under the sun, all sides understood that truth, however slow, would find its way into view. In some inscriptions, oaths are sworn before Utu, in which the speaker does not ask to be forgiven, but asks that if he lies, the light will expose it. This is a form of justice that does not comfort, but endures. It rests on fear of being seen rather than hope of being spared. One of the most powerful images of Utu appears later on the stele of Hammurabi. In the carved relief, Shamash does not hand the king a sword or a punitive flame. He hands him a measuring rod and a ring, symbols of measurement and of order made visible. The message is unmistakable. Power can exist legitimately only when it operates under light, when the ruler's actions can be measured, compared, and laid bare before the community. A tradition tells of a major lawsuit in which both sides presented persuasive arguments, and the judge delayed his decision until the sun stood at its highest. Not because he awaited a divine sign, but because he believed the midday light does not allow ambiguity. Under harsh sunlight, evasions become harder to sustain. Small details that disappear in shadow suddenly become clear. Utu in that moment does nothing, and yet his light has already done the most difficult work. What distinguishes Utu from many later gods of justice is this: Utu does not promise moral reward. He offers no assurance that good people will be happy, no guarantee that virtue will be met with prosperity, and no pledge that wrongdoing will be punished swiftly or in a way that satisfies human emotion. In the world shaped by his light, there is no notion of instant fairness. The universe does not rush to correct itself in response to human expectations. The only promise that exists is far starker and far more enduring. No act disappears completely. Everything leaves a trace, if not in the mind of witnesses, then in the fabric of relationships. If not in written memory, then in patterns of consequence. And if not today, then tomorrow, when circumstances align and the echo of an earlier action finds a surface on which it can be heard again. Utu's justice is not theatrical. It does not strike with spectacle. It unfolds slowly, impersonally, and often without warning. And precisely because of this, it cannot be bargained with or escaped through time alone. This may sound cold, even merciless, but within the context of ancient Mesopotamian societies, it was an immensely stabilizing idea. These were cultures acutely aware of fragility, of how easily cities could vanish, how quickly alliances could dissolve, how rapidly memory could be erased by floodfire or war. In such a world, justice that depended on immediate enforcement would be unreliable. What mattered more was continuity. When memory is pressed into clay, when contracts are written, oaths recorded, and verdicts sealed and stored, action ceases to be a fleeting moment. It acquires duration. It becomes something that persists beyond the life of the individual who performed it. A decision made today can reappear decades later, read by someone who was not yet born when the mark was made. In this sense, writing itself becomes an extension of Utu's light, carrying truth forward in time. The reputation of a person, a family, even an entire city could thus stretch across generations. Trust was not a matter of personal charm or moral declaration. It was cumulative, built slowly, lost slowly, and once damaged, extraordinarily difficult to restore. In such a system, a lie did not need to be punished immediately to be dangerous. It only needed to remain visible, preserved, waiting. At the right moment during a dispute, a trade negotiation, a political crisis, that preserved lie could resurface. And when it did not merely condemn an individual. It weakened the entire network of trust on which society depended. One false oath could ripple outward, making future promises suspect. One corrupt verdict could cast doubt on the legitimacy of law itself. Utu's justice operates precisely at this level, not in dramatic moments of retribution, but in the long-term integrity or erosion of social bonds. This understanding transforms justice from a moral drama into a structural principle. Justice is no longer about emotional satisfaction about seeing wrongdoers suffer, but about whether a system can continue to function without collapsing into suspicion and fear. In this framework, patience replaces vengeance, and memory replaces punishment as the primary force of accountability. Utu's light then does not glare. It endures. It does not rush to resolve tension, but allows consequences to accumulate until they become unavoidable. And because it does not depend on immediate human intervention, it remains operative even when rulers die, courts fail, or witnesses disappear. In the end, Utu does not ask people to be good in order to be rewarded. He asks them to understand that nothing they do is weightless, that every action enters a world that remembers in its own way, and that memory, slow, impersonal, and relentless, is what ultimately binds a society together or pulls it apart. For that reason, Utu's justice lies not in the final outcome, but in the durability of truth. Once exposed under light, truth can outlast every justification. It may be covered temporarily, blurred by power or ritual, but it does not vanish. And it is precisely this stubborn endurance that makes Utu's justice more frightening than any threat, because a person can endure suffering for a moment, but it is far harder to live with a stained memory that lasts through one's life and one's descendants. Within this logic, Utu becomes the protector of the weak, not because he takes their side in every dispute, but because light makes imbalance visible. When a farmer stands before a powerful landlord, the inequality can be concealed behind titles, ritual, and legal language that only one side fully understands. In the shadow of power, injustice can be presented as natural order. But when the matter is brought into the light, when words, actions, and consequences are placed side by side, that imbalance is no longer invisible. And here is the key point: the Sumerians did not believe society reacts out of compassion. They believed society reacts out of fear of chaos. A personal injustice can be ignored, but an injustice clearly seen will shake collective trust. Once a community realizes that power can manipulate law in darkness, it begins to doubt every other promise. Trade slows. Oaths lose value. Contracts become fragile. And when trust collapses, order, the very thing ENLIL represents, begins to tremble. That is why Utu's light is not a moral gesture, but a defensive mechanism of society. It forces power to restrain itself not from fear of divine punishment, but from fear of exposure before the community. In a world where people live close together, where memory is preserved and passed on, that exposure can be more destructive in the long run than any physical penalty. This also explains why Utu's justice is not comforting. It does not tell the weak, "You will be compensated." It says only, "What happened will not be erased." And sometimes that is all a society needs in order not to slide into unstructured violence. Because when truth is preserved, even painfully, the possibility of repair remains. When truth is buried completely, the only thing left is blind conflict. In this view, Utu is not the god of kindness. He is the god of public memory. His light does not heal wounds, but it prevents wounds from being denied. And in the ancient world, just as in any complex society, the refusal to deny truth is the minimum condition for a community to continue to exist. So when the Sumerians called Utu the god of justice, they did not imagine a perfect moral balance. They imagined a world where actions leave traces, where power cannot act entirely in darkness, and where truth, slow though it may be, still has a chance to survive longer than lies. It is not a justice that makes people happier. It is a justice that prevents society from collapsing under what it refuses to face. There are legends that Utu once helped those wrongly imprisoned by opening a path for them not through magic, but by allowing the truth of the case to emerge little by little. A witness recalls a forgotten detail. A trace is found. A lie contradicts itself. These stories do not feel fantastical. They feel investigative. And that is exactly what makes Utu strangely modern. He represents the belief that given enough light and enough time, truth will rearrange the world. In everyday life, Utu is also bound to the rhythm of labor. Sunlight determines working hours, rest the opening of the market, the end of legal proceedings. Time under Utu's light becomes a kind of soft justice. Everyone is subject to the same cycle of day and night. No one can extend the day for themselves alone. No one can hide an act forever in darkness. This equality does not come from an abstract idea of human rights. It comes from the simple reality that everyone lives under the same sun. What matters is that Utu does not stand in opposition to ENKI or INANNA. He binds them. Enlil's order, if it becomes ruthless, will be exposed by its social consequences under the light. ENKI's intelligence, if it turns into cunning, will have its motives revealed. INANNA's desire, if it exceeds its bounds, will have its true cost made visible. Utu does not stop these forces from operating. He makes it impossible for them to operate in darkness. Perhaps that is why Utu is not the most beloved god. He offers no comfort. He allows no escape. But he is the god society cannot do without. Because a world that moves without light quickly becomes a labyrinth of lies. And an order that cannot be seen soon becomes tyranny. When the Sumerians looked up at the sun, they did not see only a source of life for crops. They saw a reminder repeated every day that this world may be harsh, but it is not completely blind. That no matter how great power becomes, it must still pass through light, and that justice, slow and cold, still has a very concrete shape. What happens will be seen. That is why Utu does not need to judge. He only needs to cross the sky. When Utu's light crosses the sky each day, it does more than expose individual acts. It gradually creates a collective habit, the habit of living, as though every action can be seen. From that habit, law is born not as a divine command dropped from the heights of heaven, but as a human effort to preserve light after the sun has set. Law in the Mesopotamian understanding is light made durable, so that even when there is no direct witness behavior, cannot entirely escape. Here, law is not a promise of kindness. It is a warning of consequences. When rules are carved into stone or clay, they do not claim the world will be fair. They claim the world will remember. And that recorded memory once made public forces society to respond in ways that can be anticipated. Predictability, not mercy, is the foundation of stability. Ancient law codes, therefore, do not try to conceal their hardness. They do not soften consequences with moral language, nor do they attempt to make punishment emotionally acceptable. They list outcomes bluntly, sometimes coldly, even harshly by modern standards. Yet this bluntness is precisely the core of justice within Utu's logic. For Utu, the most dangerous thing is not pain that can be seen, but power acting in darkness. In darkness, punishment is no longer the consequence of behavior. It becomes an instrument of will. In darkness, the same act can lead to different outcomes, depending on who enforces the rule, on social rank, on private relationships. And when that happens, order is no longer order. It becomes arbitrariness dressed in ritual. The Sumerians understood this danger clearly. A merciful system that is not explicit will always be more dangerous than a harsh system that is predictable. So, ancient law chooses to speak plainly, almost without ornament. If you do this, the consequence will be that. There is no promise of exceptions, no shadowed corner where secret bargaining might take place. In this worldview, rigidity is not designed to crush people. It is designed to shield society from ambiguity. A clear punishment, even a severe one, still allows a person to calculate their actions. They may fear the consequence, but they understand it. By contrast, a system in which consequences are uncertain forces people to live in blind fear, not fear of law itself, but fear of the unknown. And fear of the unknown corrodes social life far more deeply than fear of a rule. This is why ancient law does not soften its voice. It does not whisper. It does not persuade. It announces. Law in this sense is light made rigid. Once something is illuminated publicly, it no longer belongs to private interpretation. Everyone sees it. Everyone knows it exists. And precisely because it is visible, it becomes binding. Darkness allows room for negotiation, favoritism, and denial. Light removes those spaces. When light is framed into law, it carries no ambition to make human beings virtuous. Ancient law does not assume that people will behave well if they are taught gently enough, or if they are morally inspired. It assumes something far more sober, that people will act according to their interests whenever those interests can be calculated. And so law does not attempt to reform the soul. It attempts to make behavior predictable, not through trust, but through consequence. This is a crucial distinction. A society built on trust alone is fragile, because trust collapses the moment memory fades, leadership changes, or scarcity appears. A society built on consequence can endure longer because it does not rely on the goodness of individuals. It relies on shared knowledge. When consequences are known in advance, society does not need to gamble on personal virtue in order to survive. Within this framework, justice does not lie in deciding who morally deserves what. That question is too fluid, too dependent on interpretation, emotion, and circumstance. Instead, justice lies in everyone knowing what will happen. Equality in this logic is not a quality of outcome, but a quality of illumination. The same act leads to the same consequence, at least in principle, at least under the open sky inscribed in text. And although reality will always be more complex than any tablet of law, the mere existence of a public standard creates something invaluable, a reference point against which violation can be recognized and addressed. This is why legal codes, such as Hammurabi's, do not conceal their severity. They do not apologize for it. They do not fear being judged as harsh. Because within Mesopotamian thought, true cruelty does not reside in visible punishment. It resides in unpredictability. When people do not know what will happen if they break a rule, they do not live within order. They live within anxiety. And prolonged anxiety erodes trust far faster than any public sentence ever could. Unpredictability turns every interaction into a gamble. It makes power arbitrary. It transforms authority into threat rather than structure. In such a world, people do not adjust their behavior rationally. They shrink, hesitate, or lash out. Law, when clearly articulated, removes that condition. Even when the punishment is heavy, it restores a form of stability, the knowledge that the world responds in a consistent way. When behavior can be calculated, order gains the ability to outlive individual rulers. It no longer depends entirely on memory, charisma, or goodwill. It becomes anchored in something external to any single person, a system of consequences that has been exposed to light. Human beings may still act unjustly. Judges may still err. Kings may still abuse power. But they cannot plausibly claim ignorance. They cannot pretend the rule was invisible, and that inability to pretend is the greatest victory of light. Because once law is written, once consequence is made visible, society acquires a shared horizon. People may resist it, violate it, or attempt to bend it, but they must do so openly against something known. In that sense, ancient law does not eliminate injustice. What it eliminates is denial. And in a fragile world, constantly threatened by flood, famine, and collapse, eliminating denial is not a small achievement. It is the difference between chaos that arrives suddenly and order that holds just long enough for a civilization to endure, remember itself, and be remembered. Yet the Sumerians were not naive enough to believe law by itself was sufficient. Utu's light does not stop at carving words into stone. It continues to shine on the distance between words and lived reality. When law is used to cover privilege, when punishment applies only to the weak, light reveals that misalignment. And when society sees the misalignment, law, no matter how deeply carved, begins to lose its force. This is a subtle point in Utu's thought. Light does not sanctify law. It tests law. Therefore, Utu's justice is not a destination, but an ongoing process of exposure. Law is light preserved. Social response is light amplified. And collective memory is light extended through time. No step in that process guarantees happiness. But together, those steps prevent society from sliding into its most dangerous condition, the condition in which power needs no explanation. In such a world, rigidity is not the opposite of justice. It is the condition by which justice does not dissolve into darkness. And Utu, by letting light operate without negotiation, leaves humanity a lesson that is not pleasant, but enduring order does not exist because of kindness, but because behavior can be made visible, measurable, and impossible to entirely deny. What matters is that Utu does not stand on the side of law as an untouchable, sacred object. His light also shines upon law itself. When law is abused, when rules become tools to conceal injustice, that same light reveals the contradiction between inscription and practice. In Mesopotamian history, periods of instability did not come only from the absence of law, but from law losing credibility when the community saw that rules no longer reflected the actual behavior of those in power. Once light reveals that distance, order begins to crack. At this point, Utu's justice proves harsh in another way. It protects no structure from truth, not even the structures humans build to maintain order. Law can be carved deeply, but if it is used in darkness, light will make it fragile. This is why in many texts, light is linked with opening eyes, opening doors, opening testimony. Justice does not come from locking society into rules. It comes from continually opening those rules before light. In social life, this principle creates a form of fairness that is not gentle but persistent. The weak are not promised victory, but they are promised that imbalance will not be entirely invisible. And that alone forces the strong to restrain themselves, not because they become compassionate, but because they understand that power, if exposed as arbitrary, will erode trust in the whole system from which they themselves benefit. Justice for Utu does not protect the weak through love. It protects them through the strong person's fear of losing order. When Utu is placed beside ENLIL ENKI and INANNA, the Sumerian structure of thought becomes clearer than ever. ENLIL sets limits so the world does not burst apart. ENKI teaches humans how to adapt so they are not crushed by those limits. INANNA creates motion so the world does not turn to stone. But all three forces, if operating in darkness, can become dangerous. Order without oversight can become oppression. Intelligence unseen can become cunning. Desire unexposed can lead to meaningless destruction. Utu does not eliminate these forces. He binds them by the possibility of being seen. This also explains why Utu's justice is not salvific. It does not lead human beings to a happy ending. It keeps them in the game of responsibility. When actions leave traces, people are forced to reckon with the future, not because they are more moral, but because they cannot pretend the past has vanished. Public memory, once it exists, becomes an invisible force shaping present behavior. There are ancient stories that say Utu's light passes even through the underworld. This image is often misunderstood if read too quickly, as though it were a promise of post-mortem justice, a warning that wrongdoing will be punished after death. But that is not what the Sumerians meant. The underworld in their imagination was not a moral courtroom. It was a place of dust silence and sameness where all the dead, good or bad, shared the same fate. To say that Utu's light reaches even there is not to claim retribution beyond the grave, but to assert something far subtler and far more unsettling, that truth is not confined by the visible limits of society, nor raised by time distance or death. What is done does not vanish simply because the actor disappears. An act leaves a residue. A crime unpunished in one generation becomes a shadow in the next. A broken oath does not die with the speaker. It lingers as doubt. A city that deceives loses trust long after the original deception is forgotten. A lineage carries a damaged name, not as a curse, but as a consequence. In this sense, light is not a beam that shines only in the present moment. It is time itself turning back upon what has been done and revealing how actions echo forward. Utu's light does not chase individuals into the underworld to judge them. It illuminates the web of consequences that remains among the living. Even when an act is buried, even when no one dares speak of it, even when the one responsible is long gone, the effects rise quietly into the life of the community. Trade relationships sour. Alliances weaken. Words lose weight. Trust thins. The Sumerians understood that no wall, no grave, and no silence is thick enough to fully contain what has been set in motion. Seen this way, light is not merely a physical phenomenon associated with the sun. It is a principle of continuity. It is the idea that the world remembers, even when people forget. That memory is not sentimental, not compassionate, but structural. The world does not forgive or condemn, it reflects. And reflection over time becomes consequence. At a deeper level, Utu represents a radical philosophical stance. Instead of seeking comfort in the belief that the universe is inherently just, the Sumerians accept something far harder. The world offers no guarantee of fairness. Innocence does not protect against disaster. Virtue does not ensure survival. Suffering does not require guilt. But this lack of fairness does not make the world unintelligible. On the contrary, it demands understanding. Utu embodies the belief that while the world may not be fair, it can be known. And knowing even without consolation is what allows a society to endure. Understanding does not erase loss. It does not undo famine, flood, or war. But it allows people to respond instead of disintegrate. It allows patterns to be recognized, mistakes to be corrected, and limits to be respected. In the harsh environment of the Mesopotamian plain, this distinction mattered profoundly. Rivers that gave life could also annihilate entire cities. Drought could unravel generations of careful planning. In such a world, promises of moral balance would have rung hollow. What mattered was not reassurance, but orientation. Not hope that the world would be kind, but knowledge of how it behaved. The capacity to adjust to rebuild canals, rewrite laws, realign rituals was more valuable than any promise that suffering would be redeemed. This is why Utu's light closes the journey of the gods. Not with comfort, not with resolution, but with responsibility. His light does not soften the narrative, it sharpens it. It leaves behind an obligation to look directly at how order is maintained, how intelligence is applied, and how desire is restrained or released. Nothing is exempt from illumination, not power, not ritual, not intention. No force is allowed to operate entirely in darkness. No authority can claim invisibility. No story is permitted to remain unquestioned forever. Light does not save, it exposes. And exposure in the Sumerian mind is the condition that makes endurance possible. When the gods withdraw and the night returns, Utu's light does not promise protection. It leaves behind clarity. And clarity, though unforgiving, is what allows a civilization to live with open eyes, aware that the world does not owe it justice, but that understanding remains within reach as long as something continues to shine. And here, Sumerian myth completes what it has always aimed toward, not explaining why humans are happy or unhappy, but explaining how a society can continue to exist, even knowing it is not perfect. Under Utu's light, the world does not become better, but it becomes harder to lie. And in a world under pressure, sometimes that is all that is necessary for order, intelligence, and motion, not to destroy each other. When the sun sets, light disappears from the surface. But what has been seen does not disappear with it. It remains in memory, in text, in social consequence. And the next day when the sun rises, the cycle begins again. Not to bless, but to remind no action sinks completely into oblivion. That is Utu's justice, not comforting, not negotiable, but bright enough for a fragile world to remain standing. There is a very particular feeling that arises when reading ancient Sumerian texts at night. It is not a feeling of terror nor of excitement, but something much more subtle and almost imperceptible distance that is difficult to name. As if you are hearing a voice that is not entirely directed at you. It does not try to draw you closer. It does not explain itself. It does not ask to be believed. It simply exists steady and indifferent, like wind passing over bricks worn smooth by centuries, like the rhythm of water flowing through a canal that has changed course countless times. And it is precisely within that distance that we begin to touch what the Sumerians called the outer world. For them, the gods did not live in the human world. But this did not mean that the gods lived on another planet or in a place reachable by a road, a journey, or any form of movement. Outside, in this sense, was not a physical distance. It could not be measured in steps or drawn on a map. It was an existential distance, an invisible yet absolute boundary that could not be crossed by strength or ambition, but only felt through awareness, the sense that there are forces forever standing beyond human life, even as their influence reaches into every moment of human existence. In Sumerian thought, the human world was defined not by drama or despair, but by duration. It was the world of birth, aging, illness, and death, a sequence so obvious that it did not need to be mourned or dramatized. Everything that existed did so for a time, and then gave way. Cities were raised from mud brick and effort, and later collapsed, not as punishment, not as moral judgment, but because rivers shift foundations, weaken, and floods do not negotiate. Kings ascended thrones and issued decrees, and then they died. Not because they failed, but because time does not exempt authority. Laws were proclaimed, enforced, revised, and replaced, not because truth had changed, but because the conditions of life never remained still long enough for any single rule to remain sufficient. Nothing in this world was permanent, and this impermanence was not treated as tragedy. It was treated as fact. To the Sumerians, the fragility of human arrangements was not evidence of divine cruelty. It was the starting point of thought. A world that changes requires attention. A world that erodes requires maintenance. And a world that forgets requires record. Even memory itself was understood as unstable. It could not survive on intention alone. It required material anchors. Clay had to be gathered. Tablets had to be shaped. Signs had to be pressed deeply enough to resist erosion. And readers had to be trained patiently, generation after generation. Without these efforts, memory dissolved as easily as breath in the cold night air. The Sumerians recognized that forgetting was not a failure of character, but a natural consequence of time. Writing, therefore, was not a bid for immortality. It was an act of resistance against disappearance, a way to slow the inevitable, not to defeat it. This clear-eyed view of impermanence defined the boundary between humans and gods. In such a world, the gods did not belong to the cycle of life and death. They did not age. They did not fall ill. They did not die. They did not require succession or replacement. And it was precisely this difference that placed them outside. Not outside the cosmos, not in some distant spatial realm, but outside the cycle that governed all living things. Outside decay. Outside erosion. Outside the anxiety that everything meaningful will eventually vanish. The gods existed as another layer of reality, one in which order did not need to be rebuilt each morning. In the divine realm, law did not weaken through repetition or neglect. It did not need to be remembered in order to remain valid. It simply was. While human order had to be constantly reasserted through ritual decree and enforcement, divine order stood without effort, without fatigue, without fear of loss. This separation did not make the gods comforting. It made them reliable. Because they were not subject to change, they could function as reference points in a world where everything else shifted. Because they did not participate in human vulnerability, they could hold positions humans could not. They could judge without fear. They could maintain boundaries without hesitation. They could remain unmoved while cities rose and fell around them. To call the gods outside, then, was not to imagine them as distant spectators. It was to acknowledge that they were exempt from the conditions that made human life fragile. They did not share humanity's urgency. They did not hurry because they did not expire. They did not cling to memory because nothing in their realm was at risk of being forgotten. And yet this very distance made them essential. Without something that stood beyond erosion, human beings would have no stable point of orientation. Without an order that did not age, all order would dissolve as quickly as it was formed. The gods in Sumerian thought were not saviors from impermanence. They were its counterweight. They did not promise that life would last forever. They promised that meaning could persist long enough to matter. For this reason, when the Sumerians spoke of the gods, they did not speak intimately. They did not whisper personal desires. They did not seek empathy. The voice of these texts always maintains a distance, as if language itself understood that it was touching something not human, something that should not be drawn too close. This distance did not make the world colder. On the contrary, it made the world orderly. Because when something stands outside human life, unmoved by emotion, unshaken by fear, humans gain a fixed point from which to organize their own existence. The gods were not companions, they were boundaries. And boundaries, though not warm, are necessary to prevent everything from spilling outward and collapsing. At night, while reading these lines, one can feel this clearly. There is no invitation, no promise, only a quiet presence reminding us that the human world is finite, and that precisely because it is finite, it must be preserved. The outer world does not come to save humans from their fate. It exists to remind them that fate exists and that living responsibly within it is what truly matters. Perhaps this is why the Sumerian voice, even after thousands of years, feels so distinct. It does not comfort, but it does not despair either. It simply stands there, calm and unmoved, like a reality that does not require explanation. And within that calm, humans are invited not to believe, but to understand their own position within a world that does not revolve around them, yet remains stable enough for them to live, to build, and to be remembered. The world of the gods, however, is different. It is not drawn into the cycle of individual life. It exists at a level where law does not arise and fade, but is only maintained or violated. The gods do not live as humans live. They operate. And thus they do not belong to the human world, even though their influence reaches into every corner of it. ENKI, ENLIL, INANNA, all intervene in human fate. Yet none of them ever become human. They do not love as humans love. They do not fear as humans fear. They do not despair as humans despair. This makes them both familiar and unreachable, a presence that is known yet never intimate. For this reason, the Sumerians did not seek to become gods. There is no myth of ascension, no promise of escape from the human condition. There is no assurance that if one lives well enough, one will cross into the divine realm and become part of it. The outer world is not a reward. It is a limit. The gods represent what humans cannot become, yet must respect. Not because they are stronger, but because they stand outside the forces that make humans fragile. They do not tire. They are not consumed by the anxieties of individual lives. They do not carry the fear that tomorrow may not exist. For this reason, they do not offer humans dreams of transcendence. They do not open paths of escape from this world. What they give humans is not wings, but a frame, a structure strong enough to prevent life from disintegrating at the first crisis. In a world always on the edge of collapse, where floods could erase entire cities in a single season, where drought could crack the land and turn people against one another, where war needed no higher justification than scarcity, a dream of escape was useless. What was needed instead was a structure rigid enough to hold a community together in the face of fear. The gods in Sumerian thought were that structure. They did not console, they did not soothe, but they kept the world from dissolving into total meaninglessness, When the Sumerians said that the gods came from above, they were not speaking of a place that could be seen. They were not looking upward to find a destination. They were looking upward to affirm hierarchy. Above was where law was established, where principles existed before humans could reflect upon them. Below was where law was lived, where humans carried those principles into daily life with all their consequences and risks. Above was not distant. Above was non-negotiable. The gods belonged to the level where decisions were made without bearing personal consequences. When a god issued a judgment, they did not lose family home or life. They did not pay with their bodies. Humans, by contrast, always did. Every decision, no matter how small, could return to touch them directly. Every mistake left a mark. Every choice carried loss, whether visible, immediately, or not. It is this imbalance that creates the sense that the gods belong to the outer world. Not because they are far away, but because they are not bound by the limitations that define humanity. They do not share humanity's greatest fear, the fear of death. And when a being does not fear death, its actions acquire a different weight. It can issue judgments without hesitation because it has nothing to lose. It can maintain law without mercy because mercy does not stabilize systems. It can allow an entire city to drown in floodwaters without calling it a personal tragedy because from its perspective, this is simply a necessary correction to restore balance. To humans, this sounds cruel. But to the Sumerians, it was the price of order. If law bends to emotion, then when catastrophe arrives, nothing remains strong enough to hold the world together. The gods were not created to love humanity, but to stand firm when humanity could not. And because they stood firm, humans could organize their lives around that stability, accepting that some decisions would always lie beyond their control, and that some losses would never be answered by blame or consolation. Within this cold silence, the Sumerians did not find comfort, but they found a form of stability. A stability not rooted in hope that things would improve, but in understanding that the world has laws, and those laws do not care about individual desire. That understanding, heavy though it was, allowed humans to continue living, building, and enduring, not in illusion, but in clear awareness of their place. To modern humans, this worldview may sound harsh, but to the Sumerians, it was what allowed order to persist. If the gods themselves trembled before death, as humans did, who would hold the law when everything else collapsed? For this reason, the gods were not loved in the modern sense. They were revered. And reverence does not demand emotional reciprocity. Reverence is the recognition that something greater than oneself exists, does not need. You yet cannot be ignored. Ritual was not a plea for the gods to change their minds. It was not persuasion negotiation or an attempt to soften power. Ritual was an act of positioning a way for humans to place themselves back into the correct location within a vast order they did not create, but had to inhabit. When ritual was performed, what mattered was not the emotion of the worshiper, but the precision of the act. The sequence of steps, the timing, the spoken words, the offerings. Everything had to be correct, not because the gods needed to be pleased, but because order needed reaffirmation. Ritual in the Sumerian world was a form of maintenance, like dredging canals before the flood season, or reinforcing walls before storms. It did not create miracles, it prevented collapse. Thus, when ritual was performed incorrectly, the Sumerians did not believe that a god became angry like an insulted individual. There was no personal rage, no wounded emotion. What occurred was misalignment. A joint no longer fit. A rhythm fell out of sync. And in a world already fragile, where one abnormal flood could erase the memory of generations, that misalignment was dangerous. Dangerous not because the gods would punish, but because once order was no longer maintained, nothing remained to stop the world from sliding into chaos. Ritual, therefore, was not superstition. It was responsibility. An acknowledgement that humans do not control everything, but are still obligated to keep what can be kept from collapsing too quickly. The outer world in this context was not a place of salvation. It did not open an escape route for the weary. It did not promise that suffering would be compensated. Instead, it existed as a quiet, inescapable reminder of limits, that some boundaries cannot be crossed, that some laws do not respond to personal longing, and that humans do not stand at the center of the larger picture. This runs counter to many deeply human desires. Humans want to believe the world listens to them. They want to believe that if they are sincere enough, effortful enough, good enough, reality will respond in kind. But the Sumerian world did not function that way. It did not revolve around personal desire. It existed before humans and would continue after they were gone. The world owed no obligation to fairness as experienced by individual lives. For this reason, long-term survival demanded discipline more than hope. It required clarity about one's position and restraint from crossing forbidden boundaries. Hope might help one walk through darkness. Discipline keeps one from stepping off a cliff. In the steady rhythm of ritual, the Sumerians found a quiet kind of peace, not the peace of certainty, but of acceptance. Acceptance that not everything can be changed. That the world was not built to satisfy human wishes. And that humanity's role was not to control the entire order, but to live in such a way that order would not collapse during their lifetime. Perhaps this becomes clearest at night, while reading lines carved into clay, darkened by time. A feeling not comfortable, but grounded, like placing one's feet on the earth after realizing one has no wings. The outer world offers no promise, but it gives something else more difficult and more enduring, a position. And sometimes simply knowing where one stands within the order of things is enough to continue living, preserving, and remembering. Seen from this perspective, the modern impulse to imagine gods as beings from another world says far more about us than about the Sumerians. We live in an age obsessed with space, with the cosmos, with the possibility of leaving Earth behind. We long for a physical outside where the problems of our present world might be abandoned. But the Sumerians did not think this way. For them, there was nowhere to run. The outer world was not an escape. It was a wall. And humanity's task was not to break through that wall, but to learn how to live with order inside it. This explains why the Sumerian gods always feel strange. Not because they came from another planet, but because they were never written to resemble humans. They were not designed to comfort. They were designed to prevent total collapse. In the long nights of Mesopotamia, as wind moved across clay walls and cities fell silent, the Sumerians did not look up to dream of leaving. They looked up to remember that something remained unchanged, even as everything on earth shifted. The gods in the outer world were the living memory of that order. And for this reason, the story of the Sumerian gods is not a story about cosmic origins. It is a story about how humans confront their own finitude. A civilization that offered no heaven, allowed no illusion of immortality, yet still built cities, laws, art, and memory. This is a civilization strong in a very quiet way. If you are listening to this part at night, notice the feeling it leaves behind. Not excitement, but stillness, like realizing that not every question needs a comforting answer. Some questions only need to be placed correctly. The outer world in Sumerian thought does not invite, it observes. And within that unemotional gaze, humans learn to become more responsible for their own world. The gods did not come to lead humanity upward. They came, if we can call it coming, to ensure humanity did not forget where it stood. And perhaps that is their deepest lesson. Not that beings exist beyond the world, but that limits exist beyond humanity. And understanding them is the first step toward a civilization enduring long enough to be remembered. The Sumerians lived in a world that made no promise of salvation. There was no eternal paradise waiting beyond death, no guarantee that the good would always be rewarded, and yet they still built cities. They still wrote laws. They still dug canals. They still told stories. Because their gods, however harsh, taught them something profoundly practical, that the world does not run on kindness but on balance. ENKI gave them the intelligence to adapt. ENLIL reminded them that order is never free. INANNA showed that power always demands loss. And Utu taught that no action is ever truly hidden from the light. This is the truth of the first civilization, not a comforting truth, but one solid enough for humanity to endure for thousands of years. If by the end of this video you find yourself realizing that human history did not begin with hope, but with learning how to endure and understand the world, then perhaps the Sumerians have fulfilled their final role. If you are listening tonight, let this story close like a very slow dream. And if you would like to continue these journeys through lost civilizations, leave a comment. I'd truly love to know where you're listening from and what time it is for you. Wishing you a peaceful night. And until we meet again in humanity's next ancient story.